last week we talked about this word liberty. And as I talked about, that word is often translated in the Bible as authority. So when Paul talks about, I have the right to do something, I have the liberty to do something, he's saying, I have the authority to do something. And he talked about three basic things. He said, I've got the right to eat and drink, which of course is a contrast to how he had ended his comments in chapter 8, really the beginning of this section, where he said, if I would offend a brother by eating meat, then I'll never eat meat again. But then he goes on to make the point, but I do have the authority to eat and drink. He talks about, I have the authority to marry. And he talked about how that some of the apostles had married, but he had not chosen to marry. And then he gets into this idea, he says, do only Barnabas and I have the right to refrain from working? Now, what does he mean by refrain from working? As it applied with his relationship with Corinth. Okay, day job. That's maybe a good way of saying it. Although I suspect that he worked a lot in the day too, but it's exactly. And I really appreciated the way you said that. We'll come back to that in just a minute. But absolutely, you just hit the nail on the head that we're going to talk about. Now, at one point, we see when he first came to Corinth in Acts chapter 18, we talked about this. What did he do to support himself? Yeah, made tents. Aquila and Priscilla also made tents. That apparently this is the first time they met each other, and they were making tents together, and they were serving Christ together. And then we're told that when Timothy came and brought money that had been donated to Paul from Philippi and other churches in Macedonia, that he devoted himself completely to the word at that point. I want to kind of stop and talk a little bit about this as it relates to our current day. What term would we use to describe the relationship between Paul and the church in Corinth while he was working there with him? Would we call him an employee of the church, to use terminology that we use today? Would we call him some of the words that he uses? A servant, a manager or steward, even a baptizer? What term would we use to describe that relationship between Paul and the church in Corinth? And the reason why I'm asking this question is because that's very vital for us to understand relationships today between preachers and local churches where they're working. And obviously, we're in a situation where we may be looking to have someone work here with us at Fayette. So what term would we use to describe them? And I got to tell you, I love the freedom that I have to talk about this now. For 30 some odd years, I didn't really feel as free to talk about it as I do now, because I don't get a penny. Let's go ahead. Okay, planter was the word that he used. Absolutely. So that is certainly something that we could use to describe the relationship that Paul had with the church in Corinth. Let's look at some of these verses. I think Paul actually is addressing this a lot of times through this letter. Now, in 2 Corinthians, he's going to get into a lot more detail, but I didn't want to wait that long for us to talk about this. We're going to see several cases where he's going to talk about his relationship with the church in Corinth. Let's go back to chapter 1 to start with. Somebody can read verses 14 through 17. I'm doing this now because chapter 9 is probably the part where he covers this in the most detail in 1 Corinthians. But chapter 1, verses 14 through 17. Somebody could read that, please.
Thank God that I baptized none of you except Crispus and Gaius, so that no one may say that you were baptized in my name. I did baptize also the household of Stephanus. Beyond that, I do not know whether I baptized anyone else. For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, and not with words of eloquent wisdom, lest the cross of Christ be empty of its power.
Okay. So what's the measure of how successful a preacher is? Paul was there for 18 months. Baptized 3 people that we know of. We don't know how big the household of Stephanus was. But 3 people that he identifies. Would we call that successful? And I guess maybe the real question is that number really the definition of success? Is that why you invite a preacher to work with a local congregation? How many people can you baptize? Paul, I think, answers that pretty clearly. In fact, what does he say his role was, his responsibility in verse 17?
Preach the gospel.
Preach the gospel. We're going to come back to verse 17 in just a minute, but I want to first of all recognize that what often people will look at is say, well, how many people does he baptize? And I'll be honest, there's a lot of preachers that keep track of how many people they baptize. Yeah, Ted.
But 15, so.
Well, in the sense that he said, Christ didn't send me to baptize, he sent me to preach. Now, I will certainly make the argument that baptizing is often going to be the result of preaching. But the role was to preach the gospel. So where, and that's a good question, let's pursue that a little thought. So what is it that takes it from the gospel being preached to someone choosing to be baptized into Christ? Where is that power? Where is that? I don't know the word I'm looking for. Where's the credit go for that? With God, the gospel itself is the power to save. That's what Paul said in Romans 1. The gospel is the power to save. So what was his role? Preach. And then you let the gospel do what it's supposed to do. Let's look at some other passages. Look over in chapter, go back and see my notes here. Chapter 3 and verse 9. If somebody could read that, please. Chapter 3, verse 9. Okay, so Paul says, my role is I'm a worker for God, and you are the field. You are the building that's come about from this work that I'm doing for God. Chapter 4 and verses 1 through 5. This was shows a little bit of tension. First 5 verses of chapter 4.
A person should consider us this way, as servants of Christ and managers of God's mysteries. In this regard, it is expected of managers that each one be found faithful. It is of little importance that I should be evaluated by you or by human court. In fact, I don't even evaluate myself, for I am not conscious of anything against myself, but I am not justified by this. The one who evaluates me is the Lord. Therefore, don't judge anything prematurely before the Lord comes, who will both bring to light what is hidden in darkness and reveal the intentions of the hearts. And then praise will come to each one from God.
I like your translation. That really, really makes this point very clear and easy to see. Paul said, I'm a manager. And as often happens in any kind of a business relationship or even government, I get evaluations, or I will next year, get an evaluation from my boss. Who does the evaluating? Well, the boss. Who does Paul say I'm evaluated by? By God. I heard it said, probably a little bit sarcastic, that preaching may be the only role where there's one employee and everyone else is a manager. That's not what I'm seeing here. What is Paul saying here? There is one employee. How many managers are there? There's one manager. And so Paul is, and there, like I said, there's a little bit of tension. He said, it's a small thing for me to be evaluated by you. Obviously, there were some in Corinth who were doing that, evaluating how effective they thought Paul was in his work among them. Paul wasn't much interested in their opinion on that. He said, there's only one opinion that matters. And that's the Lord's opinion. Go back to chapter 1 and verse 17 again. I said we'd come back to this. What does he say there? Who did the sending? Who did the sending? Christ did. Chapter 3, verse 9, we don't have to go back and read it again, but he said, I am God's workman. You are the field, you are the building, but I am God's workman. It's an important distinction. It sounds like maybe you're arguing semantics at times, but it really is an important distinction to recognize that Paul did not consider himself to be an employee of the church in Corinth. In fact, one of the questions I've got written down here, is there any difference at all in the relationship of Paul with the church in Corinth, whether he accepted financial support from them or not? No. It had a difference in the way they perceived it, which is why he refuses to accept it. Or in Philippi and other places, he did accept it. He said, I've got the right. But then there in chapter 9, he says, I didn't exercise these rights. I didn't exercise these liberties as we talked about. He said, I'm doing that for your sake, to help you, that I don't do that. But the fact is, there was nothing different about his relationship, the work that he was doing in Corinth, whether they gave him a penny or whether they gave him, hundreds of denarii. Because he wasn't working for them. He was working for the Lord. And that's an important distinction for us. For us to understand that if we invite someone to come and move here and live and work among us, we're not hiring somebody. It's a very important distinction. We are not hiring somebody. What are we doing? Well, what did he say? Receiving support. What we're doing is we're going to agree to support his financial needs and his family so that he can do what? Preach the gospel, preach for the Lord. Serve his manager. Or serve his boss as a manager. So anyway, just kind of keep that in mind as we go through that process ourselves. This is what Paul is showing us. And as I said, 2 Corinthians, we're going to see that a lot more in detail, especially chapters 10 through 12. Wouldn't hurt to go ahead and read that just to be thinking about as it is a decision that we as a congregation will be making. To look at what Paul tells us about that relationship with a preacher and the local church. Anybody got any comments or questions before we move on this further?
I think that's a really important distinction. I've always kind of questioned the use of hiring a preacher, that verbiage.
Yes.
And I don't think it's particularly sinful to say that. We get what people mean to say, but the connotation of that this is some sort of boss employee or, democracy or something like that. That we are bringing this person in to proclaim the gospel message, and the success of that will be determined by the Lord ultimately.
Right.
And then, we are supporting them. We are assisting them, providing for them. And that's all, consistent with scriptural usage. We're paying a preacher. That just sounds,
Right.
again, connotations.
And there's a whole lot of other things involved that start talking about office hours and what are we expecting and all these sorts of things. It's not what we expect. It's what the Lord expects. Now, ultimately, it obviously comes down to questions. If he's teaching false doctrine, we can't have fellowship with that. If he's not serving the Lord, we can't have fellowship with that.
Just kind of a question to just kind of walk
Sure.
through. I don't want to take up time.
No, you're fine.
In terms of, when we do speak with someone or when someone is coming to work with us, especially with your experience in the past, is there a line between this is what we want you to do versus this is the need that we are hoping that you will help us to meet?
Yep. I very much like the second. Because somebody coming in, especially if they're moving to that area, have lived there, doesn't really know the area, they're going to benefit by you saying, these are some needs that we think you can help us with, that you can help the Lord with in this area. These are some things that we think can be done. Much more differently than saying, this is what we want you to do for us. I appreciate very much that question, that language. Anybody else with any thoughts or comments?
But just sort of trying to convert what you do is more biblical language, but you're still going to apply to the guy who doesn't do what you're expecting him to do, then you just are kind of muddying that poor communication.
Right.
And maybe not completely made your expectations clear. So I'm just a little concerned there's a little bit of room to avoid the word employee, but still think of the person as an employee.
And that's partly why I bring this up, because the old cliche is words have meaning. And if we keep using the wrong language, we guide ourselves in the wrong direction. If we use the right language, we guide ourselves in the right direction. It doesn't change overnight. My views are still changing after 30 some odd years of, 40 some odd years of being a Christian. 50 some odd years. This is getting older as I go. But that's the point, is what I learned from other people. I hear it once, makes a change. I hear it a second time, the change becomes a little stronger, a little firmer. And that's all this is tonight, is just kind of help us think about what our language is, think about what our thoughts are of this relationship. And let's just keep thinking and keep talking about it. So I appreciate very much your thoughts. It's not just simply, let's change our words, but the meaning's the same.
And also, if you're going to do that, then I think you have to make sure that, because one of the downsides, I think, of thinking of a person as an employee is that it becomes someone who just kind of comes, works with you for a while and then moves on. And if you're going to get away from that, then I think you have to make sure that you understand that this person is not an employee, but they're a part of this congregation. They're still a member of this congregation, and maybe that becomes even more important. And by being a member of this congregation, they're still subject to the authority of the elders. So this is the same way as the elders can tell the deacons, this is what we want you to do. And you don't say, well, I don't care.
Right.
I don't. That should be their answer. The preacher is also going to be subject to the elders, maybe not in the same way that an employee is subject to a boss, but as the way the sheep are always subject to the shepherd, or maybe in the case of the elders, the assistant shepherd.
Yeah, I like that. The shepherd and the chief shepherd. Absolutely. Very good point. Anybody else with thoughts? Yeah, Ted.
I think it's out of the realm of law that Paul is declaring what this specific role was versus what we're supposed to do. Okay, I think some of the apostles had very specific goals, just like we have different talents.
Right.
So just because Paul declared at that point that his job wasn't to baptize per se.
Mhm.
Doesn't let anyone else off the hook or anything like that.
Sure.
So educating on this for sure. If
Yeah.
it's just about spreading the word.
Mhm.
And then God gives the increase. It's hard for me to not notice or recognize that some men are very effective
Mhm.
in their Bible studies to convert, to lead people,
Mhm.
and then, and the result, baptism, which grows the kingdom and grows the foundation. and
Yes.
grows the church. And some can do a lot of Bible studies, and there just aren't a lot of conversions.
Mhm.
I'm afraid that that's like. I don't think the world should be just roll up, just spread the word, spread the word, spread the word. I think
Right.
some people have talent. I think some people can see where you're hurting.
Mhm.
And I don't want to go sell and say like you're hot buttons or something.
Right, I
like
understand.
that. But I effectively know what's amiss in your life. I get to know you.
Mhm.
You know, obviously I can't not think of my father or my dad.
Sure.
You got to know people so well
Mhm.
and so comfortable and trusted. And I don't want to say you have to score this way, but people be baptized or help become baptized was a good number.
Mhm.
Was not a bad thing to say, I find role and importance in helping people to be immersed.
Exactly. And to use the First Corinthian analogy, go back to chapter 3, Paul says, I planted and Apollos watered. Two different roles. Both of them were serving the Lord effectively. And he said, and the result is God gave the increase to the work that both of them were doing. The planting was increased by God, the watering was increased by God. And so I agree with you. Yeah, absolutely. So I agree with you fully. It is not one role fits everyone. Absolutely. But there is one God who gives the increase to all of it. And that's the key, is to understand we're not holding this man responsible for what the gospel is doing. What we're holding him, or what God holds him responsible for, is for doing what his skills are. Absolutely. That's an important thing, is a man needs to understand, what am I skilled at? And to use that for God's kingdom. Very good discussion, Pat.
Sometimes to my emphasis is on baptism and then every baptism is kind
I fully agree. I've seen it happen way too many times. Yep, absolutely.
Well, I feel like, isn't that Paul's emphasis here, though?
Mhm.
In saying, I wasn't sent to baptize you. His role is to proclaim the gospel in a manner that facilitates bridging a relationship between you and Christ.
Mhm.
You know, who does baptism? He doesn't care. I mean, I'm sure when Peter, proclaimed the gospel in Acts chapter 2, and thousands, literal thousands of people were baptized. Peter wasn't tick marking like,
Right.
okay, I got all those. No, Peter preached a message that, and Peter didn't pierce the hearts of those people. The Holy Spirit pierced.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Peter facilitated
Mhm.
because they needed to hear it. And as Paul writes in Romans, how
Right.
to believe they have heard.
Yeah.
And so Paul just preached that, Peter just preached that message. The Holy Spirit pierced the heart, and then men were baptized.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. That's excellent. That's exactly the point. Really, really good discussion, at least from my viewpoint. I hope that it's been profitable for us to talk about that. All right, let's get back into chapter 9. We talked about the first 18 verses, and this was the key word. I have the right, I have the liberty, whatever translation you happen to be using. From what we've already learned about Paul, what do you think is going to be the key word in the next section? What does Paul often do when he focuses on one thing, and then what's he going to focus on in the next section? You ever heard somebody say, well, what's the opposite side of the coin? I think Paul was the first one who said that. So what's the opposite of liberty? What's going to be our key word that we're going to talk about for the last half of chapter 9? Yep, the responsibility duties, but he's going to get stronger than that. He actually uses it in verse 19, and then the very last verse, I forgot what the number is. What's the key word that you see? Slavery, exactly. And it's kind of going, wait a minute. Paul, you've been talking about liberty. You've been talking about the freedom that we have in Christ. And now what does he say? I make myself a slave. Paul did not intentionally just try to make people's heads spin, but sometimes when you look at his writings, and you really start digging into it, I know that sometimes it does that to me. You know, he's been talking about his freedom. He's been talking about, I have the authority, I have the right. But now he says, I'm a slave. But of course, the key is, how did he become a slave? Or maybe the better question is, who made him a slave? And he answered it there, verse 19. Paul made himself a slave. I make myself a slave. This actually goes back to something Ted talked about, I think, either last week or the week before. You know, that feeling like I'm under compulsion. Paul was under compulsion. But remember, when somebody tried to compel Titus to be circumcised, what did Paul say? I won't give in for an hour. He dug his heels in and said, no, you are not going to do that. No slavery here. So now why is he saying, I make myself a slave? Well, part of it is, remember, liberty is the authority. It's the right. And so what Paul has said, I've got all these rights, and one of my rights is to commit myself, to make myself a slave. And what kind of a slave is he? Yeah, it's a slave to service. It's a slave to service to Christ. And specifically, what is he trying to accomplish with that? What's the last part of verse 19? He's trying to win people to Christ. Then there you go. Preaching the gospel, what's the goal of preaching the gospel? Winning people to Christ. So yeah, he does have that as his goal. But it's not just let me get them in the water. It's let me show them Christ. And the gospel is the way you show them Christ. And when they see the gospel, the power of the gospel is going to change their heart. Adam said it, pierce their heart. It pierces their heart, and they are won to Christ. And so Paul says, I make myself a slave to do that. When you talk about making yourself a slave, I don't even know how to fully describe this. It's a commitment, but it's so much more than just a commitment. It is a total commitment. It is what controls you. And that's what Paul says. What controls me is winning people to Christ. Now, he's going to go on in verse 20, starting to talk about different things. To a Jew, I became a Jew. Well, Paul was a Jew. What does he mean by I became a Jew? Okay, became like a Jew. What's he doing? To a Jew. So he's emphasizing this is his audience, if you would. So if he's speaking to a Jew, what does he do to win them to Christ?
That's the recognizing the background.
Yeah. So, commonality, he's reaching them where they are. What's the Great Commission say? Go into all the world. I know for many years, I used to think that meant travel. It does not mean travel. What does it mean? It means what Paul is saying right here. I go to where they are, which is not a physical location. It's where is their heart? Where are they at in this world? To a Jew, I became a Jew or became like a Jew. To a Gentile, what does that mean? I became like a Gentile. I became, so there, he says, to the strong, I became strong. To the weak, I became weak. It doesn't mean he's going around sinning. It doesn't mean he's going around struggling with temptations. It means he is reaching them where they are. And I like what he says, that by all means, I may save some. I remember when I was in college, congregation I attended when I was in college, there was one man in that congregation that he was using a particular teaching tool. It was 4 lessons. I forgot the name, if he even had a name. Ivan Stewart was the writer of these. And this guy was just on fire for it. And he said, this is what's going to convert everybody. I was happy that he was on fire. But is there any one thing that converts everybody? Well, the gospel, yes, so thank you. I appreciate that. But is there any one approach? No, Paul's just said, by all means. Why would he say all means if there weren't, in fact, a lot of different approaches? Now, I know some, in fact, one of my best friends was first converted by going through that 4-series study, those 4 sets of questions. So yes, it was effective with some people in some circumstances, in some situations. And by no means am I criticizing that. There's a Bible correspondence course that Sewell Hall, who I greatly respect, wrote called Jesus the Way. I think personally that's the best correspondence course series that I've ever seen. Will it convert everybody? No. No, there's a lot of other means of approaching. There was the film strips. There is the more later, I've heard of one called The Big Picture. There's one I actually preached here in a gospel meeting, I don't know, 10 years ago, God, Man, and the Cross. It still affects me today when I preach that series. But there is no one thing. And Paul recognizes that. He says, I use every means. I use every way. Go where they are. And they're not all in the same place. And you're not going to reach them with the same thing. And that doesn't mean you have to reach everyone. But you go to your world. You go to the ones you can reach. Yeah, Mike.
Visit a Jew, talk to them, and have a pork sandwich. And you put a brother who, because of his weakness, you know, becoming like the weak would be like talk back in your weak. You think the I was really idle, and they never, you avoid it because and so he was like, this meat sacrifice. When you say this meat sacrifice to idols, I'm not going to eat it. It's nothing, but I'm going to eat instead of offending your weakness. That's what I was thinking.
I agree with you. I think what we see here is Paul is now taking it a step above that, a step beyond, maybe not above, beyond that. That absolutely, he had talked about essentially their relationship with one another in that family. But I think what he's showing now is this extends beyond that. This same idea of giving up your liberty, your right, so that you can serve those outside the family by winning them to Christ. And so he's saying every means there is. Now, what's interesting is He says, by all means, that's, it includes everything. I might save what? Some. What's necessarily implied by that? Yeah, not everybody's going to respond. They may not respond to you specifically, where they may to someone further down the road. Or they may not respond at all. That's the parable of the soul of the sower. We see there were 4 types of soil. We need to recognize that as we're reaching out and preaching the gospel, there will be some people who will literally or figuratively just say no. When Jesus sent his apostles out on the limited commission, what did he tell them? When they go into a village, if the people will not accept you, shake the dust off your feet, go to the next village. Shaking the dust off your feet, we think of it almost like as a curse for that village, but I would suggest to you there's another thing in that. Don't let that discouragement, that stink, if you would, stay with you. If you've been preaching the gospel and someone just says no, you don't take that no with you. Who was it? Boy, that thing goes fast. Winston Churchill, during World War II, said success consists of going from failure to failure without loss of enthusiasm. I love his quotes. We need to recognize that there's going to be what seems like a failure. It's not a failure. If you're preaching the gospel, it's not a failure. But if someone's not baptized, someone just doesn't want Christ, don't lose any enthusiasm. Shake the dust off your feet, move on to the next person who may say yes. And I think that's the attitude that we see in Paul here. Let me very quickly, there are a couple of other things I wanted to notice. Verse 24, he talks about running a race and boxing. What's Paul talking about now? Well, remember, this is a Greek audience. What were the Greeks known for? The Olympic Games, or in this case, probably the Isthmian Games that were held in Corinth. Sporting events. This is something they knew well. Here is a great example of Paul doing the very thing he said. To a Greek sports nut, I became a sports nut. And he starts talking about running a race. And what is it that they won when they won that race? Yeah, the laurel wreath. We've seen the pictures of what that looks like. What does Paul say? We win if we win the race of life. The imperishable crown. Jesus references the same thing in the book of Revelations. This is so much better than sports. And that's still a great lesson for us today. Verse 27 comes back to the same idea. I make my body my slave. What do so many people in this world do today? They let themselves become a slave to their body. In fact, the same thing was true in Corinth. So, like I said, Paul kind of makes my head spin sometimes to realize how he flips things around to look at things. All right, next week we'll get into chapter 10. It's still going to continue the same thought. This all goes back to this question. Paul, can we eat meat that's been sacrificed to idols? And finally in chapter 10, he's going to get to the root of why they asked that question and why he didn't answer it directly. Thank you.